May Calloway hit the ground before the stage stopped rolling. She didn't wait for the driver, didn't wait for the steps. She dropped straight into the mud of Gravel Bend's main street, straightened her coat, and looked across the road at the man standing beside a burning barrel. He was feeding something into the fire. Paper. Her paper. She had written 4 pages. He hadn't read 1. He felt her watching and turned, and his eyes were the flattest, emptiest eyes she had ever seen on a man still breathing. She was supposed to be his wife by sundown. He looked at her like he was already sorry she'd come. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. Every story I tell for you, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. The man didn't come to her. He stood at the barrel and let the last of her letter catch and blacken and curl, and then he kicked dirt over the base of the flame and walked to the hitching rail without hurrying. 2 horses tied there. He untied the smaller one and held the reins out toward her without a word. May crossed the street and took them. "May Calloway," she said. "Cole Darnell." His voice was flat as the land behind him. "You're smaller than the photograph." "You burned my letter." "Saw the stage coming. Figured I'd meet you instead of read about you." "You burned it before the stage came in sight." He looked at her then. Really looked. Something behind his eyes shifted. Not guilt, not apology. Just the recalibration of a man who had expected one kind of woman and gotten another. He didn't answer. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up. May tied her bag to the saddle, mounted without asking for help, and followed him north out of town. They rode the first mile in silence. The wind off the ridge was sharp and smelled like coming snow. May studied the land as they climbed. Brown grass flat against the frost. A creek running thin between cottonwoods. The roof of a barn just visible in the valley below. She calculated without meaning to. Grazing capacity, water access, distance to the rail line. "How many head?" she asked. Cole glanced back. 80. "You finished with 80 last season?" A pause. 63. 17 lost. She did the math and kept it behind her teeth. The house was 1 story, clapboard, porch sagging on the east end. The barn was in better repair than the house, which told her everything she needed to know about this man's priorities. She approved of it completely. Inside, the floor had been swept, and the table wiped in the stiff, deliberate way of a man who had been expecting company and didn't want to show how long it had been since any came. A fire had been laid, but not lit. An optimism he hadn't committed to yet. Cole set her bag by the door. "Back room's yours. I'm in the loft. You handle the cooking and the house. I handle everything outside." He moved to the stove and crouched to lay kindling. "We don't need to discuss what came before." "I need to see your ledger books," May said. His hands went still on the kindling. "The financial records for the ranch." She kept her voice level. "I managed accounts at a bank in St. Louis for 5 years. Before that, I kept books for a grain merchant. I can read a ledger the way you read a fence line. I can tell you in 20 minutes what your balance sheets are hiding, and in an hour whether any of it is fixable." She paused. "If you wanted someone just to make biscuits and sweep, you should have said so in the advertisement." Cole stood up slowly. He turned and looked at her, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes had gone the color of a sky before serious weather. "The books," he said, "are in the box under the loft ladder. You open that box, and I'll put you on the next stage myself." He went out. The door shut hard. May walked to the box under the loft ladder, opened it, and took out the ledger books. There were 3. She brought them to the table, turned up the lamp, and opened the first one. Cole's own handwriting in the early pages. Block letters. Careful. The penmanship of a man who had taught himself and never lost the effort of it. numbers and dates in plain notations. Head count, feed cost, sale price at market. Rough but honest. The record of a man who worked hard and paid attention to the things he understood. The second book started 2 years ago. Different handwriting on the first page. A bank clerk, or someone working for a bank. The entries were more complex. Loan amounts, interest rates, repayment schedules, quarterly adjustments. May read slowly and carefully, not looking at the numbers themselves, but at the structure around them. The way a doctor looks, not at symptoms, but at patterns. She found the first discrepancy on page 14, the second on page 17. By page 22, she sat back and pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at the stove without seeing it. The original loan rate was 6%. It was clearly marked 6% on the agreement date. But beginning with the fourth quarterly payment, the effective rate being applied had quietly shifted to 9.5%. The change was buried in a supplemental amendment on a page that had been inserted between 2 original pages. The paper stock slightly different, the margins fractionally narrower. The kind of thing invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning exactly what inserted documents felt like in their hands. Cole Darnell had not been paying down his loan. He had been making payments that barely touched the interest on a rate he had never agreed to, while the principal sat and grew, while the balance climbed quarter by quarter, while somewhere, far from this valley, a man in a good coat looked at a number on a ledger and waited for it to become impossible. May heard boots on the porch. She did not close the book. Cole came through the door and stopped. He looked at the open ledger. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him go still in a different way than before. Not the hard stillness of a man defending territory, but the tight stillness of a man who already knows something is wrong and has been deliberately not looking at it. "Sit down," May said. "I told you, Cole." Her voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. "Sit down, please." He sat, like a man lowering himself onto ice he wasn't sure would hold. May turned the book toward him and laid her finger on the inserted page. "Look at the margins on this page compared to the pages on either side." She waited. She watched his eyes move across it, and she watched the exact moment he understood. Not the legal language, not the numbers, but the bare fact of it. Something had been put into this book that was not there when he signed it. His jaw went hard as iron. "The rate on your loan was 6%, May said. "For the first 3 payments, that's what you paid. Since the 4th payment, you've been paying 9.5% without knowing it. The difference adds to your principal every quarter. Right now, you owe $412 more than you would owe if the original rate had been honored." She kept her voice steady. "At the pace they're running this, they expect you to default within 18 months. Cole stared at the page. He didn't speak. "The company that bought your loan from the original bank is called Consolidated Western Cattle. This is what they do. They buy debt from small banks across Wyoming and Montana. They insert amended terms after the original signature. They wait. When the rancher defaults, they acquire the land for the outstanding balance, which by then is almost nothing because they've been collecting inflated payments for years." May stopped. Then, "I've seen the documents from the other side. I processed filings like this at the bank in St. Louis. I didn't understand what I was looking at then." Her voice stayed flat. "I understand now." The fire she had lit while he was in the barn popped and settled. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the north wall. Cole sat without moving for a long moment, his eyes on the altered page, his hands on the table in front of him. Open. Still. The hands of a man who had just been told the ground under everything he'd built was not solid. $412, he said. That's the current gap. It compounds. I don't have $400. I know. Then what does knowing change? It means we can fight it. May leaned forward slightly. This amendment is fraud. I can demonstrate the paper stock doesn't match the originals. I can show the page numbering breaks sequence at the insertion. I can build a document case, original agreement, inserted amendment, payment history, that shows exactly what was done and when. If we get this in front of a judge with the right documentation, Consolidated Western loses the amendment. The original rate is restored. You've been overpaying for 2 years. She let that sit for a second. They may owe you money. Something crossed his face. Not hope. Something more careful than hope. The expression of a man who has received good news before and has learned the specific pain of believing it too soon. You said you worked at a bank, he said. I did. Doing what? Finding errors, and finding things that weren't errors. She held his eyes. The kind of things people put in books when they don't want them found. Cole looked at the ledger again. His hand moved toward the inserted page and stopped just short of touching it. Why didn't you put this in your letter? Because you burned my letter without reading it. The corner of his mouth moved, 1 degree. The smallest possible suggestion of something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same county. He looked back at the book, and then he looked at her, and this time it was a different kind of looking. Less like a man measuring a problem, more like a man recalibrating something he thought he had already figured out. May, his voice had dropped. The hardness in it had not gone away, but it had changed quality. Less like a wall, more like a foundation. I can't read it. The fine print. The legal language. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather. No apology, no shame, just the bare truth of a thing he had learned to work around. I could have looked at that page every day for a year. I know, May said. That's exactly why they put it there. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind keened outside. The fire crackled. This doesn't leave this room, he said. Not Ruth, not anyone in town. Not a word until we know what we're doing with it. Understood. I mean it. So do I. She met his eyes and held them. I've kept secrets that mattered before. He looked at her a moment longer, taking the measure of that statement, deciding what to do with it. Then he nodded once, stood, and reached for his coat. Evening feed. Supper when I get back. It'll be ready. He moved to the door, stopped, his back to her, his hand on the frame. You should have said in your letter you worked with financial records. May looked at the open ledger. I did, in the 4th paragraph. A beat of silence. Get to the stove, he said, and went out. She watched his shape cross the yard toward the barn, his stride long and deliberate even in the cold. The stride of a man who had learned to carry weight without showing it. Then she turned back to the books. Supper was beans and salt pork. They ate at the table, and Cole ate fast, the pace of a man who had taken every meal alone for years and had forgotten there was another way to do it. May didn't fill the silence, and he didn't try to. When he finished, he set his fork down and sat back and looked at the space between them. Ruth's going to want to meet you, he said. Who's Ruth? My brother's wife. She's in town, runs the dress shop on the main street. He turned his cup in his hands. My brother died 7 years ago. She stayed. A pause. She's got opinions about what happens out here. About the ranch. About everything. His voice was careful, even. She thinks she has a say. May looked at him. Does she know about the loan? Something moved fast behind his eyes, there and gone. She knows there's been trouble with the payments. Does she know the details? No. Cole, May kept her voice quiet. Does Ruth know that a company out of Denver has been running a fraud scheme against this ranch for 2 years? His jaw went tight. Nobody knows that. What you found tonight, that stays between us until we're ready to move on it. Are we clear? We're clear. He stood, rinsed his plate, moved to the loft ladder, put his hand on the rung. Burn what oil you need tonight. He paused, one beat. And May, he didn't turn around. Whatever you find in those books, you tell me first, before you do anything, before you tell anyone. Me first. You first, she said. He climbed. The rungs creaked under him. The loft went quiet. May turned up the lamp and pulled the third ledger toward her and opened to the back pages. She worked through the night. The fire burned low twice, and she fed it without stopping. By 2 in the morning, she had a sequence. By 3, she had a case. By 4, she sat back and pressed her hands over her eyes and breathed out slowly through the nose. The fraud was real, documented, provable. And then she turned to the very last page of the third book and found the letter. It had been folded twice and tucked against the back cover. The kind of place a man puts something he means to deal with later, and then finds reasons not to. The paper was good quality. The letterhead read, Consolidated Western Cattle Company, Denver, Colorado. The date was September 12th. The language was formal, patient. The tone of a man explaining a procedure to someone he does not expect to understand it, but wants to have on record that he explained it. May read it once, read it again, set it flat on the table. Under the terms of the amended loan agreement, Consolidated Western had exercised an acceleration clause, a provision buried in the inserted amendment that allowed the full balance of the loan to be called due immediately upon certain conditions. The conditions had been manufactured as cleanly as she had ever seen it done. The full amount was due within 30 days of the letter's date. September 12th. 30 days. It was the 3rd of November. May sat at the table in the lamplight and looked at the letter and thought about the man sleeping in the loft above her, who had put this letter in the back of a book he couldn't fully read, and had gone on feeding cattle and mending fence, and not knowing that the clock had already run out. That the 30 days had come and gone 6 weeks ago. That Consolidated Western had every legal right, under the fraudulent amendment she could prove was fraudulent, but had not yet proven to any judge, to send men to this ranch and begin the process of taking it. She folded the letter, put it back exactly where she had found it, closed the book. Somewhere outside, an owl called once into the cold dark and went silent. May blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the pure black of the Wyoming night, listening to the wind work against the walls of Cole Darnell's house, and thought about everything she knew and everything she was going to have to do. And the very specific feeling, one she had not felt since St. Louis, since the last time she had sat in a room full of evidence and understood exactly what was coming before anyone else did, of being the only person awake in the middle of a war that had already started. She was still at the table when the loft creaked at first light. May had not slept. She had sat in the dark after blowing out the lamp and listened to the ranch settle around her, the barn shifting in the wind, the horses moving in their stalls, the particular silence of a place that had been holding one man's weight for too long. By the time gray light began to show at the east window, she had made 2 decisions. The first was what she was going to tell Cole. The second was what she was going to do before she told him. She had the fire going and the coffee ready when he came down the ladder. He stopped on the second-to-last rung when he saw her sitting at the table, with the ledger books stacked to one side and a page of her own notes in front of her, her handwriting small and precise, covering the whole sheet. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Coffee's hot." He came off the ladder and crossed to the stove and poured a cup and stood with his back to the wall and looked at the books and looked at her. "What else did you find?" "Sit down." "May." "Cole, sit down and drink your coffee first." He sat. He drank. He watched her over the rim of the cup with the flat, patient expression of a man who had learned that dreading news did not make it arrive any slower. "The amendment isn't the worst of it," May said. He set the cup down. "There's a clause buried in the amendment, an acceleration clause. It gives Consolidated Western the right to call the full loan balance due immediately if you miss a payment, or if they determine you're in default." She kept her eyes on his. "They sent a letter in September. 30-day notice. Full balance due." Cole didn't move. The 30 days ended 6 weeks ago. The silence in the room changed quality. It became the kind of silence that has weight and temperature, the kind that presses against the ears. Cole's hands were flat on the table. His jaw was set. He was looking at the stack of ledger books, and she could see him working through it. Not the legal language, because he couldn't work through the legal language, but the fact of it. 6 weeks, full balance. The letter in the back of the book he had put there without reading it, and gone on living as if it hadn't come. "How much?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "Full balance as of September is $840. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "With the 2 months of additional interest since the letter, it's closer to $900. Cole stood up. He walked to the door and put his hand on the frame, and stood there with his back to her, and looked out the small window at the yard, at the barn, at the frost-pale grass of the east pasture. May watched him and said nothing. She had learned long ago that some information needed space around it before a person could begin to carry it. "They can take the land," he said. "Not yet." He turned. "The amendment is fraudulent," May said. "The acceleration clause is part of the amendment. If the amendment is invalid, the clause is invalid. If the clause is invalid, the September letter is invalid." She leaned forward. "They can't legally enforce a clause in a document they committed fraud to insert. But we have to prove the fraud before they move on the land. And we have to prove it fast, because the moment they decide we're not going to pay and we're not going to fold, they'll stop using lawyers and start using other methods." Cole came back to the table. He didn't sit. He stood at the end of it and looked at her notes, at her handwriting covering the page, at the careful, numbered sequence of evidence she had built through the night. "You wrote all this last night." "It's a documentation chain. Original agreement, inserted pages, paper stock discrepancy, sequence break in page numbering, payment history showing the rate change, the September letter." She tapped the page. "A judge who is not in Consolidated Western's pocket looks at this and sees fraud. Clear, demonstrable, documented fraud. And a judge who is in their pocket." May didn't answer immediately. "That's the other problem," she said. "We need to know which judges in this territory they've reached before we decide where to file." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not the recalibration of the night before. Not the careful reassessment of a man meeting a new kind of person. This was something rawer. This was a man looking at the full size of the hole he was standing in, and finding that it was deeper than he had known, but that someone was standing in it with him. "Ruth," he said. May went still. "She knows someone in the county clerk's office. She's been—" He stopped, pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. She told me 6 months ago I should talk to someone about the loan, that something didn't feel right about the payments. His voice had an edge in it now, turned inward, the edge of a man cutting himself. I told her to stay out of ranch business. Why? He looked at her directly. Because she's been trying to manage this ranch from town since my brother died, and I have been letting her think she has a say because she lost Thomas and she needed something to hold on to. His jaw tightened. But she doesn't have a say. This is my land. Cole, May's voice was careful. What exactly did Ruth tell you 6 months ago? That a man had come to the dress shop, asked her questions about the ranch, about me, about whether I had family, whether I had anyone helping me manage the finances. He paused. She said the man worked for a cattle company out of Denver. The room went very quiet. She told you a man from Consolidated Western came to talk to her, May said. 6 months ago. And you didn't think that was worth knowing about the loan? I thought he was looking to buy stock. I get men through here sometimes looking to buy. He was mapping your vulnerabilities. May said it flat, no judgment in it, just the fact stated clean. A man alone, no family, no one watching the books, no legal knowledge. He went to Ruth to find out how isolated you were. She looked at the ledger. They had already inserted the amendment by then. They were deciding whether you were worth pursuing or whether you'd fight back. Cole put both hands on the table and leaned on them and stared at the wood grain. His breathing was controlled, deliberate. The breathing of a man holding something down with everything he had. I have to talk to Ruth, he said. Yes, May said, but not today. He looked up. If you go to Ruth today, you're going to be angry. And if you're angry, she's going to be defensive. And if she's defensive, you won't find out what she actually knows. May folded her hands on top of her notes. Give me 2 days. Let me find out who holds the loan paperwork at the county clerk's office and whether the original deed filing is intact. Let me build the case on paper before we talk to anyone. She paused. Then we go to Ruth together. Cole looked at her for a long time. She could see him wanting to argue, and she could see him recognizing that she was right. And she could see the specific frustration of a man who was used to solving problems with his own hands, finding himself in a problem that required a different kind of hand entirely. 2 days, he said. 2 days. He straightened up, picked up his coffee cup, drank the rest of it standing. I've got a fence section down on the south line. I'll be out until mid-afternoon. He set the cup on the shelf. If anyone comes to this door while I'm out, you don't tell them anything about the books. You don't tell them you've seen the books. You don't tell them your name if you can help it. Has anyone come before? 2 weeks ago, a man on a gray horse said he was from the county assessor's office, asked to see the property deed. Cole's voice was level, but his eyes were not. I told him the deed was filed with the county clerk in town, and he could go look at it there, same as anyone else. What did he look like? Good coat, soft hands, didn't sit his horse like a man who rides for work. Warren Holt, or one of his people. May thought it and kept it behind her face. If anyone comes today, I'll tell them you're on the property, and they're welcome to ride out and find you. Cole held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded and reached for his coat and hat. At the door he paused. You want to go into town with me tomorrow? Yes. Early, before the shops open. He pulled the door open and cold air pushed in around him. And May, he looked back at her, one hand on the frame. What you said last night, about keeping secrets that mattered. His voice was low. How long did you keep them? May looked at him steadily. Long enough to know which ones are worth keeping and which ones get people hurt. He looked at her another second. Then he went out. She listened to his boots cross the porch, descend the steps, move toward the barn. She listened to the barn door, the horses, the particular quiet of a place resuming its daily shape. Then she pulled her notes toward her and kept working. The man on the gray horse came at 10 o'clock. May heard the hooves from the window and watched him come up the trail. Not a gray horse, a roan, but everything else matched what Cole had described. Good coat, clean boots, the posture of a man who thought of riding as inconvenient rather than natural. He tied the horse at the porch rail and knocked on the door with the unhurried knock of someone who expected it to be answered. May opened it. He was somewhere near 50, well-fed, with a watch chain across his vest and eyes that did a quick, complete inventory of everything visible behind her before they settled on her face. He had the smile of a man who used it the way other men used a handshake, a tool deployed for specific purposes. "Mrs. Darnell," he said, not a question. He had done his research. "My husband is on the south fence line," May said. "You're welcome to ride out." "I'm sure I can find him." He didn't move toward his horse. "Warren Holt, Consolidated Western Cattle Company. I believe we've had some correspondence with Mr. Darnell regarding the terms of his account." May kept her hand on the doorframe. Her face was pleasant and empty. "I wouldn't know about that. My husband handles the ranch business." "Of course," Holt's smile held. "I was hoping to speak with him about bringing the account current. There's been some confusion about the payment schedule, and we'd like to clear that up before it becomes a legal matter. I'll let him know you came by." "I'd appreciate that." He reached into his coat and produced a card, held it out. Cream paper, engraved lettering. May took it without looking at it. "There's another option available to Mr. Darnell, if he's open to a conversation. Consolidated Western is prepared to offer a fair market price for the property. Given the current state of the account, it might be simpler for everyone." "I'll let him know you came by," May said again. Something shifted in Holt's eyes, just for a moment. Not anger, assessment. He was looking at her the way he had looked through the door, taking inventory, recalibrating. He had come expecting a ranch wife who would be flustered or sympathetic or frightened. He was looking at something else and trying to decide what it was. "You're new here," he said. "I am." "Where did you come from, Mrs. Darnell, if you don't mind my asking?" "St. Louis," May said. "Before that, Columbus. Before that, a small town in Ohio that you've never heard of." She met his eyes directly. "I've lived in a lot of places, Mr. Holt. I find that people who ask where a woman comes from usually want to know how far she is from anyone who might come looking for her." She kept her voice perfectly pleasant. "My husband knows where I come from. That's enough." The smile on Holt's face went very still. It was still a smile, technically, but it had stopped doing the thing smiles are supposed to do. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Good morning, Mrs. Darnell." He mounted his horse and rode back down the trail without hurrying. May watched him go. She stood at the door until he was out of sight around the tree line, and then she closed it and stood in the middle of the kitchen and let herself feel it, the specific, cold fear that came not from danger itself, but from seeing it up close and recognizing its size. Holt was not a man running a minor fraud on a small Wyoming ranch. He was a man who had done this many times, in many places, with many families, and who had not yet lost. The way he had looked at her when she didn't fold told her he was already adjusting his approach. Men like that always had another approach. She put his card on the table and looked at it. Below the company name and address, in smaller type, Legal Counsel, Robert Amos, Denver. She stared at that name for a moment. Then she crossed to her valise, opened it, and dug to the bottom where she kept the small notebook she had carried since St. Louis, the one she had filled with names and case numbers and filing dates from the years she had spent watching documents move through offices where no one thought the woman at the copy desk was paying attention. She found the name in 7 pages. Robert Amos, Denver. Listed 3 times, all in connection with property acquisition cases in Montana and Wyoming territory. All cases where small landowners had lost to corporate interests on the basis of amended loan documents. All cases that had settled before reaching a judge. They had never lost because they had never let it get to a judge. May sat down at the table and thought about that for a long time. Cole came back at mid-afternoon. She heard him in the barn, heard the horses, heard him at the water pump. When he came through the door, she was at the stove, and she turned and looked at him, and he read her face the way she had learned men like him read things. Not with words, but with the full attention of someone who has survived by paying attention to small signals. "Who came?" he said. "Warren Holt." Cole went very still. "What did he want?" "He offered to buy the ranch." She kept her voice even. "Before that, he tried to present the acceleration clause as a billing confusion. When I didn't respond the way he expected, he shifted tactics." She turned back to the stove. "He'll come back." "What did you tell him?" "That you were on the fence line and he was welcome to ride out." She paused. "And that I came from St. Louis." Cole came to the table and picked up Holt's card. He looked at it, turned it over, set it down. "You told him where you were from." "I told him enough to let him know I wasn't afraid of him, and not enough to tell him why." May served 2 plates and set them on the table. "Sit down." He sat. He looked at his plate without seeing it. "Cole," she sat across from him, "I know his lawyer, Robert Amos. I have 3 cases in my notes where Amos represented Consolidated Western in property disputes. 3 cases, all settled before trial. Not because the landowners didn't have a case, because they ran out of money, or ran out of time, or ran out of people willing to stand with them in a room full of lawyers." She held his eyes. "We are not going to run out of any of those things." He looked at her. The flatness in his eyes was still there, but something else had moved in behind it. Not hope, still not hope, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had been fighting alone for so long that the presence of someone else in the fight felt foreign and slightly dangerous, like an unfamiliar weapon he wasn't sure how to hold. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "Because the fraud is real and you didn't deserve it." "That's not an answer." May looked at her plate. "I spent 5 years in a bank watching men do exactly what Consolidated Western is doing to you. And every time I found the evidence and put it in front of the right person looked at me and told me I'd made a mistake and handed it back." She paused. "I didn't make any mistakes. I just didn't have anyone willing to act on what I found." She looked up. "You're willing to act on it." "You don't know that yet." "I know you told Holt's man to go look at the deed at the county clerk's office instead of letting him in the door." She picked up her fork. "Most men would have let him in. You didn't. That tells me something." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Thomas would have let him in," he said. His voice had gone somewhere else for a moment. "My brother. He trusted everybody. Said you had to give people the benefit of the doubt, or you'd end up bitter and alone." Something crossed his face, quick and private. He gave a man the benefit of the doubt on a land agreement and lost his claim 6 months before he died. Spent his last winter in Ruth's sister's spare room. May set down her fork. "Is that why Ruth stayed?" "She stayed because she had nowhere better to go, and because she felt guilty for not catching it herself." He looked at his plate. "She's been trying to protect this ranch ever since. Think if she keeps it safe, she's keeping something of Thomas safe too." His voice was flat and quiet. "She means well. She just doesn't always know what well means. May thought about that. About Ruth in her dress shop on the main street. A woman who had already watched one Darnell lose land to paperwork. Who had been approached 6 months ago by a man from Consolidated Western. Who had told Cole and been told to stay out of it. A woman sitting in town right now who knew something she hadn't said yet. Tomorrow, May said. We go to the county clerk's office first. Then we go to Ruth. Cole picked up his fork. Together, he said. Together. They ate in the quiet of the early evening, the fire burning steady, the wind working its way around the corners of the house, and outside in the last of the gray light, the land lay cold and still under a sky that was the color of a held breath. And somewhere down the valley, on the road that led back toward Gravel Bend, a man in a good coat rode at an easy pace and thought about how long it usually took before people in places like this understood that they had already lost. He had not yet met May Calloway at a table with a lamp and 3 ledger books and 7 pages of notes and a name in a notebook she had been carrying for 3 years, waiting for exactly this. They rode into Gravel Bend before 7 the next morning, the sky still dark at the edges and the main street empty, except for a dog moving between the buildings and a lamp burning in the window of the bakery 2 doors down from the courthouse. Their breath and the horse's breath made the same white clouds in the cold air. Nobody spoke on the ride in. May had her notebook in her coat pocket, and Cole rode with his hat pulled low, and his eyes moving the way a man's eyes move when he is entering territory he no longer fully trusts. The county clerk's office opened at 7:30. They tied the horses at the rail and waited on the boardwalk, and Cole stood with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, and May stood beside him and watched the street come slowly to life around them, and thought about Ruth. She had thought about Ruth most of the night. A man from Consolidated Western had walked into that dress shop 6 months ago and asked careful questions about Cole Darnell, how long he'd been on the land, whether he had family, whether anyone helped him manage the finances. Ruth had told Cole, and Cole had dismissed it, and Ruth had gone back to her shop and sat with what she knew. A woman who had already watched this exact machinery take her husband's claim. A woman who recognized the shape of it. And she had gone quiet. That meant either Ruth was afraid, or Ruth knew something that frightened her more than the alternative. Or Ruth had made some kind of arrangement she hadn't told Cole about. May didn't know which yet, but she was going to find out. The clerk was a small man named Aldous Briggs, who arrived at 7:28, unlocked the office, and turned around to find 2 people already on his threshold. He startled visibly. Cole touched his hat. May gave the man her most neutral smile and asked to see the deed filing for the Darnell property and the original loan registration associated with it. Briggs looked at Cole. "You got a dispute pending, Mr. Darnell?" "Just want to see my own paperwork," Cole said. Briggs brought the deed file. May spread it on the counter and went through it methodically, page by page, the way she had gone through the ledger books. Cole stood beside her. She could feel him watching her hands move across the documents, and she could feel him learning something from the watching. Not the content of the documents, but the method, the specific way a person who knows what they are looking for moves through paper. The deed was intact. Original filing, April 1870, properly stamped and witnessed. The survey map attached. The chain of title clean. She photographed it in her memory and moved to the loan registration. "There's a second filing here," she said, quietly, for Cole alone. He leaned in. The original loan was registered with this office in June of 1873. "That's correct. It matches the ledger." She turned to the second document. This one was filed 8 months ago. It's a notice of assignment. The loan transferred from the First Territorial Bank to Consolidated Western Cattle Company. She read it through. Her finger stopped at the bottom of the page. The assignment notice references the amended loan agreement. By number. She looked up. The amendment that was inserted into your ledger after you signed it. It's referenced here as if it was part of the original agreement, filed with this office 8 months ago. Cole's jaw was tight. Briggs filed this. Briggs received it and stamped it. Whether he knew what it was is another question. May straightened. She turned to the clerk, who was pretending to organize papers at the far end of the counter. Mr. Briggs, the assignment notice filed 8 months ago for the Darnell property. Who brought it in? Briggs looked up. His expression had the careful blankness of a man deciding how much he knew. A legal representative. Came down from Cheyenne. Did you compare it to the original loan registration when you filed it? A pause. That's not standard procedure for an assignment notice, ma'am. No, May said. It isn't. That's why they used it. She held his eyes long enough to let him understand she was not accusing him, just marking him as a witness. Then she looked at Cole. I need to make copies of both the deed and the assignment notice. Do you have paper, Mr. Briggs? They were out of the clerk's office by 8:15, with 2 pages of May's precise handwriting and the knowledge that the fraudulent amendment was now part of the official county record. It had been there for 8 months, which meant Consolidated Western had been building their legal foundation since before the September letter. They were not improvising. They had been constructing this for the better part of a year. May folded the copies into her notebook and put it back in her coat pocket, and stood on the boardwalk and looked at the dress shop across the street. The sign in the window said, Darnell's Alterations. The lamp inside was already burning. She's in early, Cole said. He was looking at the shop with the expression of a man bracing for something he couldn't outrun. She knew we were coming, May said. Gravel Bend isn't a big town. He looked at her. How do you want to do this? Let me start. You listen. She met his eyes. Whatever she says about the ranch, about the loan, about any of it, you don't get angry. Not yet. We need what she knows more than you need to be right. His jaw worked. She should have told me more about that man who came in. Yes, and you should have listened when she tried. May said it without softness, just the plain shape of it. That's the past. Right now, we need the present. She held his gaze until she saw him accept it, not happily, not easily, but with the specific discipline of a man who understood necessity. Then she crossed the street. The bell above the door rang when they entered. Ruth Darnell came from the back of the shop and stopped when she saw them. She was about 40, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the upright posture of a woman who had built her own life from the remaining pieces of someone else's, and refused to let it show how heavy the building had been. She looked at May first, a full, frank assessment, the kind that took in everything and filed it immediately. And then she looked at Cole. You should have come sooner, Ruth said. To Cole, not to May. Ruth, 6 months ago I told you something was wrong. You told me the ranch was your business. Her voice was controlled, but the control was costing her. I told you that man made me uncomfortable, and you said I was being dramatic. I know what I said. Good. Ruth looked at May again. You found the books. May looked at her. Yes. Ruth pulled a chair from beside the counter and sat down, and her shoulders dropped half an inch. The drop of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally reached the place where they can set it down. How bad is it? Bad, May said, but fixable if we move quickly. She sat down across from Ruth. Cole remained standing by the door. The man who came in 6 months ago, Warren Holt. Ruth's chin went up slightly. He said he was looking to buy grazing rights. Wanted to know if Cole would consider selling a parcel. I told him Cole didn't sell parcels. He ran a full operation. She paused. Then he started asking about Cole's situation. whether he was alone out there, whether he had anyone helping him manage the accounts. Her mouth tightened. I told him Cole was private about his business. Then he said, she stopped. Ruth, May kept her voice quiet. What did he say? Ruth looked at her hands. He said he hoped the accounts were in good order. He said sometimes men out here alone got behind on their paperwork and it caused problems down the line. She looked up. He said it like he was being helpful, like he was a neighbor warning me about something. Her voice had gone flat and hard. I've heard that kind of helpful before. Thomas heard it too, right before he lost the Henderson Creek claim. What did you do after he left? May said. A pause. A long one. Ruth looked at Cole. Cole looked back at her with his arms crossed and his jaw set and said nothing, which was the right thing, and May was glad for it. I wrote a letter, Ruth said, to the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Asked them about the status of Cole's loan. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced an envelope, folded and worn at the crease from being opened and closed many times. She held it out to May. They wrote back. May took it. She unfolded the letter and read it again, and then she set it on her knee and pressed her hand flat over it, and sat for a moment with her eyes on the middle distance. Cole pushed off the door. What does it say? The First Territorial Bank says the loan was sold to Consolidated Western Cattle Company 14 months ago. Not 8 months ago. 14. May looked up. The assignment notice filed with the county clerk 8 months ago was filed 6 months after the loan had already changed hands. They waited 6 months before they made it official. 6 months where they had legal control of the debt, but no public record of it. She looked at Ruth. Did you show this to anyone? I showed it to Judge Garrow. The room went quiet. Cole straightened. Hector Garrow. He's the only judge in this county, Cole. What did Garrow say? May asked. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. He said the bank had every right to sell the loan, and that I should mind my own business and let Cole handle his affairs. She looked at her hands. He said it nicely. He said it the way men say things to women when they want them to stop asking questions. She looked at May directly. He's been to Holt's office in Cheyenne. I know because my cousin's boy works at the hotel there and saw them having dinner together twice last fall. Cole made a sound, low, not quite a word. I know, Ruth said to him. She said it with the exhaustion of someone who had been knowing it alone for months. I know, and I didn't know how to tell you. And every time I tried to bring up the loan, you shut the door in my face, and I... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I didn't know what to do with it, Cole. I still don't. May looked at the letter in her hand, then at her notebook, then at the window with the pale morning light coming through it and Gravel Bend's main street going about its business outside, ordinary and unhurried, people moving between shops, a wagon coming in from the North Road, a world that looked completely normal over the top of something rotten underneath it. Garrow can't hear the case, May said. If we file here, he'll dismiss it or delay it until Consolidated Western has already executed on the acceleration clause. We need to go over his head. She looked at Cole. The territorial court in Cheyenne. We file there. We bypass the county court entirely on the grounds that the county judge has a conflict of interest. Cole looked at her. Can we do that? Yes. It's slow and it's expensive, and they'll fight us every step, but yes. She paused. I need to write to a man in Cheyenne, a lawyer named Daniel Fry. He handled 2 property cases I worked on from the bank side, both cases where landowners were fighting corporate fraud. He lost one and won one, but he knows how to fight the fight. She looked down at the letter from the bank. "And I need this letter, Ruth. This is evidence. Can I keep it?" Ruth looked at her for a moment, with the frank, appraising look she had used when they first walked in. The look that was taking measure of something beyond the surface. "You know what you're doing," she said. Not a question. "I know exactly what I'm doing," May said. Ruth looked at Cole. Something passed between them. Years of grief and stubbornness, and love and blame, and the particular bond of two people who had both failed to protect someone they cared about, and had been living in that failure ever since. Cole looked away first. His throat moved. "Keep the letter," Ruth said. May put it in her notebook. They were standing to go when Ruth said it. She said it to Cole, not to May. And she said it quietly enough that May almost missed it. "He came back," Ruth said. "Holt. He came back 2 days ago." Cole turned. "He came to the shop." Ruth stood with her hands clasped in front of her. "He said he wanted to let me know that the situation with Cole's account had become urgent, that they were prepared to make a generous offer for a quiet settlement." She paused. "He said it would be better for everyone if the family encouraged Cole to take the offer, before it became unpleasant." "He came to you," Cole said. His voice was very quiet. The quietest May had heard it. "He came to you to get to me." "He thought I'd be easier to convince than you." Ruth's chin came up. "He was wrong." Cole looked at his sister-in-law for a long moment, and May could see something move across his face. Complex, layered. The movement of a man dismantling something he had built wrong, and finding that the foundations were still solid, even if the structure had been off. He crossed to Ruth and put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just for a second. The most contact either of them were probably capable of on a regular day. And Ruth closed her eyes for just that second, and then opened them again, and Cole stepped back, and the moment was over. "Lock up early tonight," he said. "Don't open the door to anyone you don't know." Ruth looked at him. "Cole, I have been locking my own door for 7 years." "I know it." He touched his hat brim. "I'm asking anyway." They rode out of town with the morning fully broken around them, the sun up and sharp on the snow still caught in the shadows of the buildings. The road north stretching ahead of them between the brown winter fields. May rode with her notebook in her coat pocket, and the weight of everything she'd added to it pressing against her side like a second heartbeat. She was thinking about Daniel Fry in Cheyenne, and what she was going to write to him, and whether he would come. She was thinking about the 14-month gap between when Consolidated Western had bought the loan and when they'd filed the assignment notice. A gap that suggested they had been planning this acquisition for longer than anyone had known, which meant there were probably other ranches in this territory in the same position as Cole, other ledger books with other inserted pages, other men living on land that was already being quietly maneuvered out from under them. She was thinking about Warren Holt sitting across a dinner table from Judge Garrow, and the specific satisfaction of a man who had already secured every exit before he lit the fire. And she was thinking about the thing Ruth had said that kept returning to her, circling back the way a critical detail always circled back when she had not yet figured out how it fit. Holt had said it would be better for everyone if the family encouraged Cole to take the offer. Before it becomes unpleasant. Before it becomes unpleasant. He had not said before it becomes complicated. Not before it becomes difficult or before it reaches the courts. He had said unpleasant. The word of a man who was not thinking about lawyers. "Cole," May said. He looked over at her. Holt told Ruth the situation needed to be resolved before it became unpleasant. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. That's a specific word. When a man like that uses a word like that, it means he's already decided what unpleasant looks like. and he's deciding whether to use it. Cole rode in silence for a moment. You think he'd move against the ranch? He's used to people folding before this point, and we haven't folded, and now he's recalculating. She paused. When men like Holt recalculate, they don't get more patient. Cole's hand moved without thinking to his hip, the habitual reach of a man checking for something that was supposed to be there. How long before your letter gets to Fry in Cheyenne? 3 days to get there, 3 days to hear back, if he writes immediately. She looked at him. 6 days minimum before we have legal representation, and that's assuming he takes the case. And if he doesn't? May was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily on the frozen road. The cold was deep and clear and absolute around them. The kind of cold that made sound carry strangely, the way everything seemed closer than it was. He'll take it, she said, because when I write to him, I'm going to tell him about the other names in my notebook, the other cases, the pattern. She looked at Cole. A lawyer who wants to make his name in this territory doesn't say no to a case that could bring down a company running coordinated fraud against Wyoming landowners. She paused. And if he's the man I think he is, he'll be angry enough about it to do it right. Cole looked at her. The flatness in his eyes had shifted over the past 2 days. Not gone, not replaced by something easy or soft, but altered. Like a piece of land that has been frozen through a long winter and is just beginning, in the deepest layers, to feel the change of season. You've been building toward this case for 3 years, he said. It was not an accusation. It was something more careful than that. An observation offered slowly, like a man extending something fragile. May thought about the notebook, the names and dates and case numbers written in margins and on the backs of filing carbons, and later, when she'd had money for a proper book, in neat columns. The evidence she had gathered not because she had a plan, but because she could not stop herself from seeing it, could not unfeel the wrongness of it, could not be the woman at the copy desk who looked at what was in front of her and chose not to understand what it meant. I didn't know what I was building toward, she said. I just knew it mattered. Cole turned his face back to the road. He rode for a while without speaking. The ranch came into view below them as they crested the ridge, the familiar pattern of buildings and fence lines and winter-pale fields, the thin smoke rising from the chimney where the banked fire was still breathing. His land, his brother's dream and his grief and his 12 years of solitary work, and the things someone else had decided without asking him was already theirs. Write the letter tonight, he said. I will. And May. He didn't look at her. His voice had the quality it got when he was saying something that cost him, the particular low evenness of a man spending something he didn't have in great supply. What you told Holt yesterday, about not being afraid of him. He paused. Were you telling the truth? May thought about standing at that door, with Holt's smile doing its inventory of everything behind her. She thought about the cold that had moved through her when she recognized what he was, and understood that he had already moved on this land and would move further. She thought about the notebook in her coat and what it represented. Years of watching and waiting, and carrying information that no one with any power had ever been willing to act on. No, she said honestly. I was afraid. I just didn't let it show. She looked at the ranch below them. There's a difference. Cole looked at her then. Really looked. And something in his face opened the smallest degree. Not the careful recalibration of the first night, or the controlled receiving of bad news, but something underneath both of those. Something older and more fundamental. The expression of a man who has been alone in a particular way for a very long time, and has just recognized, without quite being ready for it, that he is no longer. He didn't say anything. He turned his horse toward the trail down to the ranch, and May followed, and neither of them spoke the rest of the way down. But when they reached the yard, and Cole dismounted and took her horse's reins without asking, and when May went inside and sat at the table and opened her notebook and picked up her pen, the silence between them had changed again, had deepened into something that was not absence but presence, the warm, specific weight of two people who have agreed, without saying so, to stand in the same place. She wrote the letter to Daniel Fry by lamplight. 4 pages, precise and complete. The documentation chain laid out clearly, the evidence named and organized, the request stated plainly at the end. She sealed it and set it on the table. Outside, Cole was still in the barn. She could hear him moving through the familiar evening sounds of a man closing up his property for the night. The sounds she had been hearing for only 3 days, but had already begun to know, the way you know the sounds of a place that has started, without announcement, to become yours. The lamp burned, the fire settled, and somewhere between Gravel Bend and Cheyenne, on the same road a man in a good coat had ridden back down 2 days ago. Warren Holt was deciding that patience had its limits, and that it was time to stop waiting for Cole Darnell to fall and start making sure that he did. The letter went out on the morning stage the next day, and then there was nothing to do but wait and work and watch the road. May watched the road the way she had learned to watch things, not with obvious attention, but with a peripheral awareness of someone who had spent years in rooms where the important things happened at the edges. She cooked and cleaned and went through her notes each evening and added to them. And Cole went out each morning and came back each afternoon. And they ate together and talked about what needed talking about, and left the rest in the silence where it had always lived. And the silence was different now, fuller, the way a room feels different when it has been inhabited long enough to hold the shape of the people in it. On the 4th day, Cole came in from the east fence line with his jaw set and his eyes flat, in the way May had learned to read as news he hadn't decided how to deliver yet. He hung his coat and sat at the table, and she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him and waited. There were men on the south boundary this morning, he said. 2 of them. On the consolidated western side of the fence line, just inside it, looking at the land. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Not doing anything, just looking. They want you to see them, May said. I know it. They want you to come out and confront them so they have a reason to escalate. She looked at her coffee. Don't. Cole looked at her. That's my land they're standing on the edge of. I know. And they know you know, and they're counting on what that does to a man. She met his eyes. The moment you ride out there with your rifle, they stop being trespassers and start being witnesses to your aggression. And Holt's lawyer writes it down, and it becomes part of the record they're building. She paused. They are trying to make you angry enough to make a mistake. That's what this is. Cole was quiet for a moment. His jaw was still tight, but she could see him working through it, setting something aside that cost him to set aside. How long do we wait? Until we hear from Fry. And if Fry doesn't come? He'll come. May said it with more certainty than she felt, which was the right thing, because what Cole needed right now was not her honest assessment of probability. He needed the version of things that kept him from riding out to that fence line. He'll come because the case is solid, and because I gave him enough in that letter to know it. Cole drank his coffee, set the cup down, looked at the table. Thomas would have ridden out, he said. Not with bitterness, just the plain statement of a difference between 2 men, one living and one not. Thomas lost his land, May said quietly. Cole looked up. She held his eyes and didn't soften it, because softening it would have been the wrong kind of kindness. The kind that felt gentle in the moment and cost more later. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he nodded once, the short, decisive nod of a man closing a door on something, and he picked up his cup again. The reply from Daniel Fry came on the 6th day. May was at the table when Cole brought it in from the postwriter. She recognized the Cheyenne postmark before she recognized anything else, and she held it for just a moment before she opened it. The specific suspended second before the thing you have been waiting for becomes the thing you know. Fry wrote in the clipped, efficient style of a man who charged by the hour and had learned not to waste words. He had received her letter. He had read it 3 times. The documentation chain she had described was, in his assessment, sufficient to support a fraud claim in territorial court, if the physical evidence matched her account. He had 2 conditions. First, he would need to examine the original ledger books and the inserted pages in person before he agreed to file. Second, May would need to be present at all proceedings as a material witness and documentation expert, which meant she would need to sign an affidavit attesting to her professional background and her findings. He would be in Gravel Bend in 4 days. May set the letter on the table and pressed her hand flat over it and closed her eyes for just a moment. Not from relief. It was too early for relief. But from the specific feeling of something that had been potential becoming actual. The feeling of a door that had been standing closed, finally swinging on its hinges. Cole was watching her. He's coming. 4 days. She opened her eyes. He needs to see the original books, all 3 of them. She looked at the box under the loft ladder. We don't move them. We don't let them out of this house. And we don't tell anyone he's coming. Not Ruth, not Briggs at the clerk's office. Nobody. Cole looked at the box. Something moved across his face. The particular expression of a man who has kept something private for a long time and is now being asked to give other people access to it, to the evidence of his own vulnerability, laid out in columns of numbers. He looked at it for a long moment. He's on our side, May said. I know that. Cole looked at her. Doesn't mean it's easy to have a stranger go through your books. No, May said. It doesn't. She paused. But Holt already knows what's in them. The only person still in the dark is the judge. He went to the box and put his hand on the lid and stood there for a second. Then he straightened up without opening it and went to the stove and poured himself more coffee. And that was the end of it. The trouble came on the 3rd day. It came not from the south boundary or from a man in a good coat, but from Ruth, which was the direction May had been watching least carefully, and which was how it caught her. Ruth came out to the ranch in the early afternoon, which she had never done before. May heard the horse and looked out, and felt the small tightening that had become her standard response to unexpected arrivals. The body's way of asking before the mind did. Is this a threat? She watched Ruth dismount and tie the horse and cross the yard with a walk that was fast and controlled, and she knew, before Ruth reached the door, that something had happened. She opened it before Ruth knocked. Ruth came in and stopped and looked around the room quickly, in the way people look when they need to confirm they are not being overheard. Where is Cole? East pasture. What happened? Ruth pulled off her gloves. Her hands were not steady. Holt came to the shop again this morning. Not alone this time. He had a man with him. A lawyer, I think, by the way he was dressed. She sat in the chair by the stove without being invited, and May did not comment on it. He told me he was aware that Cole had been in contact with an attorney in Cheyenne. He told me the situation had moved past the point where simple settlement was possible. Her voice was controlled but tight, the voice of a woman managing something large in a small container. He said if Cole did not surrender the deed voluntarily within 48 hours, Consolidated Western would file for immediate possession based on the default on the accelerated balance, and request a court order to remove any occupants from the property. May stood at the table and felt the information land and spread. 48 hours. Fry would be here in 1 day, but 48 hours meant Holt was planning to move before Fry arrived, or at the same time. Or he wanted Cole to believe he would move immediately in order to force a decision before Fry got here. "He knows Fry is coming," May said. Ruth looked at her. "How would he know that?" "Because he has someone watching the mail." May said it flat, certain. The conclusion of a pattern she had been watching build. "He knows we went to the clerk's office. He knows we talked to you. He's been a step behind us, and now he's decided to stop being behind." She thought about Briggs at the counter, about the careful blankness on his face when she'd asked about the assignment notice, about the dog that moved between buildings on the main street every morning, the lamp in the bakery window, all the small, ordinary machinery of a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and some people were paid to make sure certain business got reported to the right party. She looked at Ruth. "Did he say anything else?" Ruth opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her hands. The pause was just long enough for May to notice it and to feel the particular quality of it. Not a pause of uncertainty, but a pause of decision. The silence of someone choosing whether to say the harder thing. "Ruth?" Ruth looked up. Her eyes were steady, but something behind them was not. "He said—" She stopped, started again. "He said that the woman Cole had brought out from street." Lewis had a history of making accusations about financial institutions that she could not support with adequate evidence. He said she had been let go from the First Territorial Bank's St. Louis branch for exactly that reason. Ruth's voice was careful, even. He said that anything she had found in the books should be taken in that context. The room was very quiet. May stood at the table and looked at the grain of the wood and thought about the senior partner's office in St. Louis, and the ledger handed back to her, and the kind smile that meant, "You are correct, and you will say nothing." She thought about the letter she had been given 2 weeks later, formal and courteous, thanking her for her service and wishing her well in her future endeavors. She thought about the specific sound a door makes when it is closed in a way that is meant to be permanent. "That's what he said," May said, not a question. "Yes." "And you believed him?" Ruth looked at her directly. "I don't know what I believe." Her voice was honest in the way that honest voices sometimes cut deeper than dishonest ones. "I know you came here from somewhere, and I know you found something in those books that Cole didn't know was there, and I know you seem to know what you're doing. But I also know that Holt said it like a man who had a file on you and had been waiting to use it." She paused. "I thought you should know he has that file." May looked at her for a moment. Ruth looked back without flinching. This woman who had been holding grief and guilt and information alone for 7 years, who had been dismissed and managed and told to stay in her lane, who had still come out here today to say the hard thing to a woman she didn't know because it was the right thing to do. "The bank let me go," May said. "That part is true. I found irregularities in loan documentation that the senior partner didn't want found. When I said so, he told me I had made an error. When I said I had not, they let me go." She held Ruth's gaze. "What isn't true is that I couldn't support it with evidence. I had evidence. I had 4 months of documentation. What I didn't have was a partner, or a boss, or a judge who was willing to look at it." She paused. "Holt has a file that says I was a disgruntled employee who made unsubstantiated claims. He has that file because someone built it specifically to discredit me if I ever showed up somewhere like this." She looked at the ledger books on the shelf where Cole had moved them. "Which means someone has been watching for me for longer than I've been here." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They knew you'd come back. They knew I'd try again somewhere." May straightened. "They didn't know I'd already found what I needed before they got here." She heard Cole's horse in the yard. He came through the door and saw Ruth, and went still for just a second. The stillness of a man reading a room and getting a result he didn't expect. And then he looked at May, and May shook her head slightly, a quarter inch, just enough. And he took off his coat and hat and hung them up and sat at the table. May told him everything. She told him about the 48 hours and the court order, and she told him about what Holt had said about her history with the bank. And she told him without decoration or softening, just the facts in the order they had arrived, the way she always presented information when the information was serious. She watched his face while she talked, and she watched it stay controlled, and she watched the specific muscle in his jaw, and she watched his hands on the table, open and flat, the hands of a man making himself stay still. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Is any of what he said about you true?" "The part about being let go, yes." "And the rest?" "No." He held her eyes for a long time. The fire crackled. Ruth sat by the stove and said nothing, and May appreciated her for it. Cole looked at her with the full, flat attention he had used on her since the first day. The attention that took no shortcuts and granted no easy answers. The attention of a man who had learned that the most important things were usually the things people hedged around. "I believe you," he said. May felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories, just a small internal movement, the quiet settling of something that had been braced. "They're going to use it in the courtroom," she said. "Holt's lawyer is going to put my dismissal on the record and use it to challenge the credibility of the evidence I've built." She kept her voice level. "Fry needs to know before he gets here. He needs to be ready for it. Write to him tonight."
"I already have the letter half written in my head."
She looked at both of them. "But there's something more immediate. 48 hours. Fry arrives tomorrow. If Holt files for the court order today or tonight, Fry may arrive at the same time as the sheriff." Cole's jaw tightened. "Garrow signs the order." "Yes, which means it goes through fast. Which means we may have less than 48 hours in practice." May looked at the ledger books on the shelf. "We need to move those books somewhere Holt can't get to them. If his people come to this ranch before Fry arrives, and those books are here—" "They won't touch my house," Cole said. "Cole," her voice was quiet, "Holt doesn't need to touch your house. He needs one of his men to be alone in a room with those books for 5 minutes. The inserted pages disappear, and suddenly your evidence is a woman's word against a corporation's lawyer." She looked at him. "Where can we put them tonight?" He thought for a moment. Ruth looked at Cole. Something passed between them, and May watched it and recognized the shape of it. Two people who had been at odds and were finding in the pressure of a specific moment the thing underneath the argument that had always been solid. "My shop," Ruth said. "Behind the cutting table, there's a floor panel. Thomas built it when we first came out here. He kept the land papers for the Henderson Creek claim in there." She stopped, looked at her hands for a moment. "He just didn't keep them current enough." She looked up. "Nobody knows about it except me. Holt's people have been watching the ranch. They haven't been watching a dress shop on the main street." Cole looked at May. May looked at the books. "Tonight," she said, "after dark. Ruth takes them back with her now, and I ride in separately after supper." She paused. "And Ruth, the letter from the First Territorial Bank, the one you gave me. I need you to write down everything Holt said to you today, in your own words, with the date, and sign it. Every time he came to that shop, Everything he said, as close to exact as you can remember. Ruth sat up slightly. You're making me a witness. You already are a witness. I'm making you a documented one. May met her eyes. He came after your family's lands 7 years ago, and he's doing it again. You have been watching this longer than any of us. She paused. I want that in writing. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and picked up her gloves and looked at Cole with the expression May had seen on her face in the shop. Complex, layered. The look of a woman who had been carrying something alone and was being asked to put it down in company. I'll have it written by the time you come tonight. She took the ledger books in her saddlebag, wrapped in the oilcloth May used for storing the dried goods, and rode back toward town in the late afternoon light. May stood on the porch and watched her go, and Cole stood beside her, and they watched until Ruth's figure rounded the tree line and disappeared. She wanted to help all along, Cole said. I know. I should have. Yes. May didn't let him finish. But you didn't, and she didn't push hard enough, and now neither of those things matters. She turned and looked at him. What matters is that tomorrow, a lawyer who has read my letter is going to walk through that door. And when Holt's people come to this yard, and they will come, they are going to find a woman who has been building this case for 3 years, and a man who built his life on this land with his own hands, and the lawyer from Cheyenne who knows exactly what fraud looks like, and is angry enough about it to say so in front of a judge. She paused. That's what Holt didn't account for. He knows about my file. He doesn't know about Ruth's testimony. He doesn't know about the chain of cases in my notebook. He doesn't know that we moved the evidence tonight. She looked at the road that led back toward town, the same road Holt had ridden down twice now, looking like a man who had already won. He has been counting on us being alone and afraid and unprepared. Cole looked at the road. Then he looked at her. In the fading afternoon light, his face had lost some of the flat guardedness that had been its default expression since the day she stepped off the stage. Not all of it, not in any permanent way, but enough to let through what had been underneath it. Something careful and real. Something that had been building in the small daily accumulations of coffee and ledger books and honest words said in difficult moments. We're not any of those things, he said. No, May said. We're not. She went inside to write the letter to Fry and to make supper and to wait for dark, and Cole came in behind her and closed the door against the cold, and the ranch settled around them with the specific solidity of a place that had been fought for, and the lamp burned on the table between the 2 chairs, and outside on the road to Gravel Bend, the hoofbeats of Ruth's horse faded into the quiet of a Wyoming evening that was the last quiet one any of them would have for some time. Daniel Fry arrived the next morning on a gray horse with a leather satchel across his back and the look of a man who had ridden through the night and didn't mind that anyone could see it. He was younger than May had expected, mid-30s, lean, with sharp dark eyes and the kind of mouth that went straight across his face when he was thinking and only moved when he had something worth saying. He tied his horse at the rail and knocked once, and May opened the door before his hand came down a second time. He looked at her. You're Calloway. I am. You wrote me 4 pages. He came inside and set the satchel on the table. Most people who want my help write me 1. The ones who write 4 either know exactly what they have or they don't know anything at all. He looked around the room, took in the stove, the table, the box under the loft ladder. You know exactly what you have. Yes, May said. Sit down. Coffee's ready. Cole came down from the loft and shook Fry's hand, and the 2 men looked at each other, with the particular assessment of men who make judgments fast and don't apologize for it. Whatever Cole saw seemed to satisfy something, because he sat without being asked and poured his own coffee and left the table to May and Fry. May laid out the documentation chain the way she had built it in her notes. Original agreement, inserted amendment, paper stock discrepancy, page sequence break, payment history, the assignment notice at the county clerk's office, the first territorial bank letter Ruth had given her, the date gap between loan transfer and public filing. She put each piece in front of Fry in order, and she talked through each one, and she watched him read with the speed of a man who had processed a great deal of paper in his life, and had learned to find the spine of an argument fast. He stopped at the inserted amendment page. He turned it over, held it up toward the window light, set it back down. "The paper stock is lighter," he said, "by about 10%. The margins are narrower on the left side, by approximately 3/16 of an inch." Fry looked at her. "You measured it?" "With the dressmaker's tape from Ruth Darnell's shop." May kept her face neutral.
It's not a surveyor's instrument, but it's sufficient to establish a measurable discrepancy that a court can verify with proper instruments.
Fry looked back at the page. Then he looked at the payment history. Then he picked up the assignment notice from the county clerk's office and read it twice. He set it down and sat back and crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way lawyers look at ceilings when they are not seeing the ceiling at all, but are instead arranging things in the sequence they can use. "They'll challenge your credibility," he said. He said it to May, not to Cole. "I know. Holt already tried it on Ruth Darnell. He has a file on my dismissal from the bank in St. Louis." She held Fry's eyes. "Everything in that file is factually accurate. I was let go. The stated reason was performance. The actual reason was that I found fraud in loan documentation, and the senior partner didn't want it found." "Can you prove the actual reason?"
Not with direct evidence. With pattern evidence, yes.
She opened her notebook and turned to the pages she had been building for 3 years. 4 cases in Montana and Wyoming territory over the past 6 years where the same structure appears. Loan acquired by Consolidated Western, amendment inserted after signing, acceleration clause executed, property acquired at default value. In 3 of those 4 cases, Robert Amos was the filing attorney. In 2 of those cases, the original loan had passed through the First Territorial Bank's St. Louis branch before transfer to Consolidated Western. She set the notebook on the table. "The same institution that employed me and then dismissed me when I began finding irregularities." Fry looked at the notebook. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he knows is going to change the shape of his next several months, and is taking a moment to understand that before he commits. Then he picked it up and began reading, and May let him read, and Cole sat across the table and drank his coffee and said nothing, which was exactly right. It was Cole who heard the horses first. He stood up from the table without rushing, which told May everything about how he had decided to carry himself today. He crossed to the window and looked, and his jaw set in the specific way it set when he was managing something. 3 riders, he said. Holt's in front. Fry closed the notebook. He looked at May. "How do you want to play this?" "You stay at the table," May said. "Cole opens the door. I stand behind him." She paused. "Don't speak until I ask you to." Fry nodded once and sat back and crossed his legs and put his hands on the table in front of him and looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been in rooms like this before and was not concerned about being in one again. The knock on the door was confident, the knock of a man who believed the door was already his. Cole opened it. Holt stood on the porch with his 2 riders flanking him and his lawyer from the previous day 1 step behind. He was carrying papers. His eyes found Cole, and then found May behind Cole, and then found Fry at the table and went very still for just a half second before the smile settled back into place. "Mr. Darnell, I'm glad you're both here. I was hoping to avoid making multiple trips." "You made enough trips already," Cole said. His voice was level. His body filled the doorframe without aggression, just presence. the presence of a man standing in front of something that was his. Holt held up the papers. "I have a court order signed by Judge Garrow this morning, authorizing Consolidated Western Cattle Company to take possession of this property based on default of the accelerated balance under the terms of the loan agreement. You have until noon today to vacate." Cole didn't move. "I'd encourage you to read it carefully," Holt said. His eyes moved to May.
"Or have someone read it for you."
"I can read it," May said. She came forward, and Cole stepped to the side, and she took the papers from Holt's hand and looked through them with the same unhurried method she used on everything. She read each page. She did not hurry, because hurrying would have told him something about her state of mind that she did not want him to know. She looked up. "This order references the amended loan agreement as the basis for the acceleration clause." "That's correct." "The amended loan agreement that was inserted into Mr. Darnell's ledger after his signature." She held Holt's gaze. "The one on paper stock that doesn't match the original document, and with margins that are measurably narrower than every other page in the agreement." Something moved in Holt's eyes. Controlled. Gone. "That's a very serious allegation, Mrs. Darnell." "It's a documented finding." She turned. "Mr. Fry?" Fry stood. He picked up the satchel and came to the door and stood beside May and looked at Holt with a pleasant expression of a man who finds his work interesting. "Daniel Fry, I represent Mr. and Mrs. Darnell in the matter of the loan fraud claim against Consolidated Western Cattle Company." He produced a document from the satchel and held it out to Holt's lawyer. "I filed a fraud complaint with the Territorial Court in Cheyenne yesterday afternoon, by telegraph. The case number is at the top of that page. Judge Harlan Willis has issued a stay on all property actions related to this account pending review of the fraud claim." He paused. "Judge Willis, I should mention, is aware that Judge Garrow has had social contact with your client in the past year, and has accordingly recused the county court from any proceedings related to this matter." Holt's lawyer took the paper. He read it. He read it again. May watched his face, and watched the moment when the information settled, and watched what it did to the careful, professional blankness he had been wearing. Holt looked at the paper in his lawyer's hand. He looked at May. He looked at Fry. He looked at Cole standing in his own doorframe on his own land, in front of his own house, with his arms at his sides and his eyes flat and patient, and entirely without fear. "This isn't finished," Holt said. His voice had lost its smoothness. Just at the edge, just barely, but May heard it, and she knew Cole heard it, and she suspected Fry had been listening for exactly that. "No," Fry said pleasantly. "It isn't. We'll see you in Territorial Court, Mr. Holt. I'll have my clerk send you the date." He stepped back from the door. "Safe ride back to town." Holt stood on the porch for a moment. His two riders were watching him, waiting for direction, and May could see him calculating. The paper in his lawyer's hand, the judge's name on it, the specific kind of damage that a territorial fraud case could do to a company that had been running this same operation in multiple counties and preferred not to have any of it examined in open court. She watched him calculate, and she watched him arrive at the only conclusion available to a man who had planned for every contingency except the one that was standing in front of him. He turned and walked back to his horse. His lawyer followed. The two riders followed the lawyer. May stood in the doorway and watched them mount, and watched them ride back down the trail toward the road. And she kept watching until the last of the dust from their horses settled back onto the frozen ground. Cole let out a breath beside her. It was not a dramatic sound, just the particular exhale of a man releasing something he had been holding for longer than a single morning. "Is it over?" he said. Fry came to stand in the doorway beside them. "The immediate threat is over. The case itself will take time. Months, possibly. They'll challenge the fraud claim. They'll try to discredit the documentation. They'll file motions. He looked at May. And they will absolutely come after your history with the bank in St. Louis. Let them, May said. By the time we're in front of Judge Willis, I'll have documentation on every case in that notebook connected to Consolidated Western. The St. Louis dismissal looks different when it's sitting next to 4 other cases where the same structure was used against landowners who had no one watching their books. She looked at Fry. I want to depose the senior partner from the First Territorial Bank's St. Louis branch. Fry looked at her for a moment. On what grounds? On the grounds that the bank sold Cole's loan to Consolidated Western 14 months ago and waited 6 months to file the assignment notice publicly, which gave Consolidated Western a 6-month window to operate against this property without a public record of their involvement. She paused. I want to know who at the First Territorial Bank authorized the delayed filing, and whether that person has a financial relationship with Consolidated Western. She looked at Fry steadily. I think they do. Fry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You have been building this case for 3 years. Since before I knew this ranch existed, May said. Since before I knew Cole Darnell's name. She looked at Cole. I came out here looking for a place to be useful. I didn't know the place was going to need exactly what I had. Fry left before midday with the ledger books in his satchel and a list of 17 items May needed him to subpoena from the Consolidated Western offices in Denver. He shook Cole's hand at the door, and he shook May's hand, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had recalibrated his expectations of a person in the course of a single morning, and was not sure yet whether to be impressed or humbled, or both. I'll write when the hearing date is set, he said. It won't be soon. These things move slowly in territorial court. He looked at the road. But they do move. He rode out and left them in the yard in the cold November air, with the ranch quiet around them, and the specific silence of a thing concluded. Not finished, not resolved completely, but turned in a direction that could not be undone. Ruth came out that afternoon. May had sent word with the post-rider, and Ruth arrived with the ledger books in her saddlebag and her written testimony in an envelope, and a look on her face that was not quite relief, but was the closest thing to it that Ruth Darnell was probably capable of on a regular day. She sat at the table and drank coffee, and the 3 of them went through what had happened and what came next, and what the case would require of each of them. And May watched Cole and Ruth talk to each other. Really talk, not the careful, managed conversation of 2 people navigating old wounds, but the direct, honest talk of 2 people who had been on the same side all along and had just found their way back to standing in the same direction. When Ruth left in the late afternoon, she paused at the door and looked at May with the frank, appraising look she had used the first day. Thomas would have liked you, she said. It was the most significant thing she could have said, and she knew it, and May received it accordingly. Thank you, May said. Ruth touched Cole's arm briefly at the door. The same gesture he had made to her in the shop, short and real and containing years, and went out and rode back to town, and the ranch settled back into its own quiet. Cole stood at the window for a moment after Ruth left. May cleared the cups from the table and banked the fire and listened to the specific silence of the late afternoon. The silence she had been learning for 2 weeks now, its textures and temperatures, and what it meant when it held different things inside it. May. His voice was quiet. She turned. He was still at the window, his back to her, his hands at his sides. He was looking out at the east pasture where the last light was lying flat across the frost-pale grass, gold and cold. The specific light of late autumn on land that had been through something and was still standing. "When Fry files this case," he said, "your name is on it." "Yes?" "Your history with the bank, everything Holt has in that file." He turned. His face was the same as it had been since the first day. The flatness, the control, the guarded set of it. But underneath those things, in the way it had been for days now, something else. Something that had been building in the small accumulations of coffee and ledger books and hours at the same table in the same lamplight, talking about things that mattered. "You're going to have to stand up in a territorial court and let them put that history in front of a judge." "I know. In front of everyone." "Cole." She held his eyes. "I have been carrying that dismissal for 3 years like proof that I was wrong, like evidence against myself." She set the cup on the shelf. "But I wasn't wrong. I was right, and I was alone, and I didn't have anyone willing to act on what I found." She paused. "Now I do. Standing up in that courtroom isn't a cost. It's what I came here to do." She looked at him steadily. "Even if I didn't know this was where I was going when I left St. Louis." Cole looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the last of the light was leaving the east pasture, and the sky was going the dark blue of a Wyoming evening that has decided to be beautiful about it. "I burned your letter," he said. "You did?" "I burned it because I had already decided before you got here that it wasn't going to work, that it was a bad idea, and I was going to meet the stage and tell you so and put you back on the next one." He said it the way he said most things that cost him. Flat, direct, no apology in the delivery, but the cost audible underneath. "I burned the letter so I wouldn't know who you were before I told you to go." May looked at him. "What stopped you?" "You got off the stage before it stopped rolling." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The closest thing to one she had seen from him. Which was saying something, because she had been watching his face carefully for 2 weeks. "And you looked at me like a woman who had been deciding things for herself for a long time and wasn't planning to stop." "I wasn't." "I know it." He crossed the room. He stopped at the table, one arm's length from her, and looked at her with the full, flat attention that had been his default since the beginning. Only it was not flat now. Not in the way it had been. Not the flatness of absence, but the flatness of something very still and very present. "I don't know how to do this," he said, "whatever this is. I've been alone long enough that I've forgotten how people—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't know how to say it without it coming out wrong." "Then don't say it," May said. "You've been feeding cattle and mending fence with a fraudulent loan on your land for 2 years, and you never fell apart. You've been standing in your own house while a railroad man tried to take it, and you never folded." She looked at him. "You don't need to know how to say it. You've been showing it every day." Cole looked at her. Something in his face settled. Not closed, the opposite. The specific settling of something that has stopped bracing and allowed itself to rest. He reached out and took her hand, the way a man takes something he is not entirely sure he deserves, and is doing it anyway, because not doing it has started to cost more than doing it. His hand was rough and warm, and she felt the weight of it and the intention in it. And she held it, and neither of them moved for a moment. "The case is going to take months," he said. "Yes." "You'll need to be here. For the depositions, for the documentation, for when Fry needs you." "Yes." "That's a long time." "It is," May said. She looked at their hands on the table between them, at the ledger books no longer there, gone to Cheyenne with Fry, gone to do the work they were built to do. At the table, with 2 cups and 2 chairs, and the fire burning, and the evening coming in, and the ranch settling around them into its nightly sounds. "I already unpacked," she said. Cole looked at her. "The first night, after you went up to the loft." She met his eyes. "I unpacked everything." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then his hand tightened on hers just slightly. Not a grip, but a choice. The particular pressure of a man making a decision he has been circling for long enough. "Good," he said. His voice was quiet and certain. "Stay that way." Outside, the first stars were appearing over the eastern ridge, faint and cold and high above the land that a woman from Ohio had come to, on a broken stage seat with $40 and a notebook full of 3 years of evidence she had been carrying alone, waiting for the place and the moment and the person that would make it matter. The wind came down from the mountains and moved through the dry grass of the east pasture and pressed against the walls of the house the way wind does against things it has tried before and failed to move. And inside, the lamp burned on the table and the fire held, and two people who had arrived at each other by the longest and least likely roads stood in the warmth of what they had built together in 2 weeks of honest work and harder honesty. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of thing that lasts. May Calloway had come to Wyoming looking for a place to remember who she was. She had found something better. A place where who she was finally mattered. And a man who had needed exactly that. And a fight worth every year she had spent preparing for it. She had not been wrong in St. Louis. She had not been wrong anywhere. She had simply been early. And now she was exactly on time.